Hello and welcome to the Humans Over Numbers podcast, the show that's willing to stand on its head to see the workplace from a new perspective. This show is brought to you by Milestones, makers of the Beyond This Day, Small Wonders, and other keepsake gifts for employees recognizing major life events. Request your sample today at milestonescompany.com and see the impact it can make for yourself. So today I talked to a guest. His name is Gil Cohen. Gil Cohen is known for being very, very active in the employee experience space. So he's a very big advocate for employee experience, not employee engagement. It's a different concept in his mind. He's very, very smart. He's very academic in a lot of the way he approaches things, but not in that put you to sleep sort of way. He's a really funny guy and has a lot of interesting stories and is able to make distinctions between very similar ideas, but make sure you are aware of how important that distinction is, like employee experiences versus employee engagement. And so we have a conversation about employee experience. And this is something that he knows a lot about because he started a company in 2020. It's called the Employee Experience Design. So he's an expert on this topic. So we talk about a number of things. If you don't know what Sonder is, you'll know at the end of today. So we talk about that word, and it's interesting. It's an interesting definition. So we have that. We also talked about the experiences and why that's really important for us to understand how important employee experience is. So we think about customer experience a lot, but what about employee experience and how they experience things? He talks about how it's really important to do that, not just for the lives employees live at work, but the lives they live elsewhere. And he uses this really cool story about a glass of water to illustrate that. And he also talks about the ways to improve it. So it's not all talk. He talks about some actions we can take to improve it. And there's the 8 pillars of wellness and how each one of those influences the experience and influences the wellness of employees. So we talk about that. And we also have this interesting conversation about listening and understanding and seeing people for who they are and really getting what it means. So we have a lot of fun. I had a fantastic time talking to him. And I think we had a lot of interesting things came to mind. And we also both learned that we love Avatar: The Last Airbender. So I hope you check this out and see for yourself. Hello, here we are again. This time we are with Gil Cohen. He's here to talk to us about employee experience, specifically how it impacts meaning in the workplace. Gil Cohen is a employee engagement expert. He is really, really in depth with a lot of the way he thinks. I find his approach extremely intelligent and academic. Every time he sort of puts out content, whether it's in a video form or it's in the article he posts, I find it extremely insightful. And I find myself just sort of blown away by the thinking he's done, especially that sort of academic thinking. I think we can hopefully tap into that and get some of that here. He actually runs his own company. He's a founder of a company called the Employee Experience Design. And I think that knowledge is going to be extremely valuable, and he's here to share some of that with us. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Yeah, I had a good weekend, and I've been enjoying life recently. Just a lot of taking the long walks and letting things slow down a little bit. Yeah.
I can appreciate that the slower pace. I've appreciated that well over the last few months.
The world wants to speed up right now, and I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm gonna take my time with these things. So
I'm with you.
Okay, so I wanted us to talk about the holistic employee experience. This is something that I think is really core to your mission and your idea. And our first point is, if our lives, we have very long lives, and I said, like, we're just slowing down and everything. And there's actually a lot of time in a week. Like, there's 40 hours in a week, but only a small amount of that time is actually what we're spent working in actually like our work lives. Now, we do feel like it takes a lot of time, but it's actually less than 1/5 of our time is in work. So why do we need to make sure we talk about the holistic portion of work if it's such a small part of our lives? So let's tackle this piece by piece. Let's say first, like, what's this holistic experience that's so important, and then why is it so important that we focus on it?
So, holistic experience is the overall experience a person has at work and the impact it has on us and how we internalize it. So, traditionally, people practices, people strategies have centered around processes, policy, people, leadership, however different people wanted to call it, talent management, human capital, whatever it is, but it's all around the people aspect. But the thing about our experience at work is it isn't just about our interactions with people. It isn't just our interactions with our boss, and as much as our boss has extreme importance when it comes to employee experience, but there's also different aspects of it. There's also the technology aspect. There's also the physical aspect. And the reality is that the employee experience, unfortunately, as a lot of people see it, is just another terming for people and culture or for HR, which is just around people practices or around events. And that's not what employee experience is. It's around all of our touch points, all of our interactions with the company, and then the way it impacts our wellness. And so you ask, why is it important? Well, there's two sides to why it's important, the employee experience, aside from the fact that it's always happening at all times. But why should we care about it? Why should we be intentional about it? Well, there's two sides to it. There's the business side to it, which is the employee experience that people have evokes certain behaviors. Those behaviors determine your company's success. If you want people to be open and sharing, you can't shut down ideas. If you want people to take risks, you can't punish people for failed risks. So that's why you have to be intentional about it. If you want to evoke certain behaviors, if you want innovation, if you want risk, you have to create the environment for it. It doesn't work in just any environment. So there's that business side of how you create your experience. People will behave accordingly. But then there's the side that I really care about, that the side that I think might be a little bit more interesting to viewers around meaning and everything, is the human side to it. Is that work impacts us? Sure, we're there 8 hours, but for everyone, work impacts our lives outside of the experience. Outside of those 8 hours, and 8 hours if we're lucky, don't get me wrong, especially in COVID, they've done studies that the average workday has extended significantly. So the reality is that it's more than just the fifth of the hour of our time that we're here, because it impacts our lives outside of work. The amount of money that we make at work determines what we're able to spend outside of work. Right? The stress we feel as a result of work determines how well we sleep at night. Do we have enough time to go and exercise? Are we working every day in an environment where the ergonomics are right and the lighting is good and it doesn't weigh down our health? All of these factors impact our lives outside of just those 8 hours where we're working. And so those 8 hours, and those are still a part of our lives. That's also the reality, is this is still, if you say it, 20% of our lives. So even at 20% of our lives, it's important. And if you factor in sleeping, it's a lot higher percentage of that of our waking hours, right? Because what percentage of our waking hours is work? And then if it's a bad environment, how much are you thinking about it at off hours? How much are you thinking about it? How much is the stress weighing you down? And for me, it reminds me of, there was a great story I read a while back, I don't know how many years ago, of a professor stands up in front of a class and asks the class, how much does this glass of water weigh? And they all give different guesses, 8 ounces, 10 ounces. And the professor says, it doesn't matter. It's all relative to how long you're carrying it. If you hold the glass just to have a drink, won't be a problem. You hold it straight up for an hour, your arm's going to start to hurt. You hold it for days or weeks at a time, you're going to do structural damage to your arm. And so the same thing is with work. If we're not able to put it down at the end of the day, well, it's stressing us, it's weighing us down. It's going to impact why we have health issues. It's going to impact why we have sleep issues, why we have stress, why we have strain in relationships. So while it's nice to think of that, humans, we could compartmentalize and only have those 8 hours and then go on and move on with our lives. It just doesn't work that way.
Wow, you gave me so much to think. I feel like my whole paradigm of like the world and the work just got shifted a little bit, and I feel like I've been looking into this stuff, and this is sort of something I've engaged in. And now it's just like, okay, my world is now a little different. Wow, I think the best way that you just put that is your employee experience. It influences your behavior, and it influences it outside of work, and that like that. So you're right. It's not just work. Is not just work, right? I've been thinking about this a little bit recently because I know a lot of people, especially for people who are not the type that their occupation is their identity. Because this was something I noticed a long time ago when I was younger, not that long ago. Was in college, everyone ties their major to who they are. They'll be like, "Oh, what are you?" And they'll be like, "Oh, I'm a bio major. I'm a math major," and that's sort of part of who you are. But once you leave that, one, what class you are, whether you're a sophomore or a senior, doesn't matter anymore. It's everyone's sort of just in the same area once they're working, but that in those titles just sort of disappear. Only a couple occupations really hold themselves as like that's their identity, like doctors and teachers are some of the only people who are like, I'm a doctor, I'm a teacher. But just about everyone else is sort of like, oh yeah, I do stuff with Excel, like that's my life. But they don't really make it who they are.
By the way, sorry to interrupt, but how many jobs did you just describe by I do stuff with Excel, myself included?
Right, it's so many jobs, and like that's what most of the market is, and we don't really categorize ourselves as that. So we think that we'll be able to siphon it off and cut it off and say, okay, that's not really part of who I am. I can tie that up, leave it there once I drive home from work, work, and now I'm home. But what you're bringing up is that work, one, it takes up that huge amount of time, especially when you cut out sleep. So it's that 20%, but it's actually a lot more of your life, of your waking life. And then you throw in the fact that you think about work outside of work, and you actually still engage with it in so many ways, and then it's your income affects your life, your hobbies, and all that. So there's so many pieces that are just fitting together all at once. So okay, there's another concept that you have that I think is really cool, and that I think will be helpful in talking about how we can get the employee experience better and more sort of wholesome. And these are your pillars of employee wellness. So these are something that you have as sort of a really important feature in creating that employee experience. You mind going over those and maybe talking about like how that might link to a better employee experience for people at work, and which will hopefully flow over the
Absolutely.
rest of their lives.
Absolutely. And I'll say that I got these dimensions of wellness from some US government agency. I don't even remember who it was, but they have it at a specific angle. What I've taken them for these 8 dimensions of wellness is talking about how work impacts each of them. So there's 8 of them. So it starts with I talk with about the financial aspect of wellness,
Mm-hmm.
which is more than just how much money we make. It's also the structure of our pay. It's our stability. There are a lot of people who March, April, May felt a lot of hit to their financial wellness who never actually lost their job because they were concerned about what's going to happen. A lot of people tightened the reins of spending, even though they never in the end actually lost their job because they were concerned about it. Because the stability that they felt pre-COVID was no longer there. So financial is one of them. Environmental is one of them. That is, what is the environment around us? There's a lot of workplace wellness people out there who do amazing stuff in terms of what's the air quality like? What is the lighting impact on our health? What is the color of the walls, the color of the carpets, the open concept? And there's a reason why it's thankfully dying, because it doesn't do well by people. I'm a very loud person. I should not be in an open concept office because I would ruin productivity for everybody else. That's just how it is. It wouldn't do well for their wellness because of noise, because of distractions, all of these different things. There's physical, which is a little bit different than environmental in that it's how things impact our body. So I often talk about ergonomics, right? Are you slouching when you're sitting? How are your arms? All of these things impact ourselves outside of work. So it doesn't matter what job you have. If you're not taking care of your body during those work hours, it's going to impact you outside of the work hours. And this isn't obviously just desk jobs, but any job. Are you hunched over? Are you upright? How long are you on your feet? How long are you sitting? How long are you walking around? So these all play into your physical wellness, and these are the way that work impacts that. Then there's the social wellness, which is our relationship with our peers. What's it like when you walk into the where everyone's eating lunch? Are you welcomed? Are you expected to sit somewhere else? Does everybody sit together? Does some people sit alone? What impact does it have on your wellness and your relationship with those around you? Then there's your occupational wellness of how we interpret our relationship with our own jobs. So, occupational wellness for some people means, for example, a nurse means their autonomy, their ability to impact patient care without having to ask somebody, without having somebody look over their shoulder, getting trusted to do that. Whereas occupational wellness for somebody who's a programmer has more to do with staying up to date with the latest programming languages, with being put in an environment that allows them to do their job and they're not just, repeating the same tasks over and over again. Then there's intellectual wellness, which is around the growth and development of our brains. Different people, and for each of the levels of wellness and each of the dimensions, everybody has different meaning behind them, and this is dynamic. So one person, financial may be at the top of their list. For another person, occupational might be at the top of their list. It all depends on the individual. And this is why it's so important that everything is individualized, because everybody is different. So there's intellectual, then there's spiritual. So spiritual wellness is around meaning and values of the work. So one of the things that's more important to millennials than any of the generations before them at work is the meaning of the company's work, the purpose of the company. More millennials than any generations before will actually value what the company does. As well, everyone values the values of the company, the behaviors. Do people behave in a way that drives me crazy every day, or do people behave in a way that aligns with what I think about? That impacts our spiritual wellness. And then finally, there's emotional wellness, which is our ability to deal with and handle our emotions. The biggest way that that's impacted at work is through psychological safety. Psychological safety is the belief that you can be open and be yourself without fear of repercussion, without fear of reprisal, without fear of any kind of negativity for just speaking your mind and being open. And psychological safety, Google did a study a number of years ago about what are the key factors of teamwork. And they found 5 key factors, but the number one factor was psychological safety. Without that, it makes teamwork a lot harder to accomplish. So these are the 8 different ways in terms of wellness that work impacts us. And it impacts all of those at all times. And you can't take that away when you go home at the end of the day. It's not easy if you're not being included, if you're being shunned. It's not easy to just shut that off. We're human beings. We can't just compartmentalize all of the things that happen at work away. There's a reason why when I talk about the feeling of Mondays, that feeling in the pit of your stomach on Sunday afternoon when you realize you have a week of work ahead of you, there's a reason why everybody I speak to has a knowing smile when I talk about that. Everybody's lived that. So I couldn't believe that we can just take these 40 hours, live that, move on, because everybody knows what it's like on Sunday afternoon to have your weekend just ruined by the idea that you have to go back to work the following day. And you feel it in the pit of your stomach. You feel it. That impacts you.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so that's a lot of pieces. Like that's 8 pillars, and each pillar expands and holds up like a small mountain on its own. Like there's a whole ceiling of world being held up by these 8 pillars. And it seems like it's a really complex concept. So how do we take that and make that practical? What's something that the leaders in a business or the managers can actually do to improve those 8 pillars for the employees so they can get that experience?
So leaders and managers need to do different things, but really it starts with intent and how you listen. So one of the struggles that I find when working with organizations is that the traditional paradigm of organizations is very top down, organization focused. The reason leaders make decisions is they want an outcome to happen, and then they create a change management plan to get there. Whereas if you include people in the right decisions in how things are accomplished, you'll be able to target their needs. You'll be able to bring them along as opposed to having to drag them along. They'll be further at the front of it because they're part of not the change management plan, but the plan in the first place. So that's at a high level leadership. So executive leadership needs to just start by thinking about the employee perspective, thinking about the employee lens. One of the most fascinating things I found about the company Amazon is that some of their meetings, they have an empty chair in the room to represent the customer, because the customer should always have a seat at the table. And I believe that executives should have the same thing for the employee population. Because unfortunately, the reality is that even the CHRO or the VP of people or whatever isn't able to necessarily represent that perspective because they're stuck at the top. They don't see what's happening at the front line. So by understanding how will decisions impact people, for example, going back to the office, there's a lot of different ways that going back to the office once things get better or are better in certain places in how they'll impact people. So leaders think to themselves, okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we need to get disinfectants. We need to create a plan and make things look. But if they're looking at it and adding that employee lens, they're also thinking, okay, how are people feeling about this right now? Do people have anxiety about going back to work? How much lead time do they need to prep before going back to work? We can't tell them the night before. And yes, I've heard stories of that happening, of companies saying to their employees, tomorrow you're coming into the office. And you can imagine then the impact on the employee experience. So that's the first thing in terms of leadership. They need to start understanding that there's an employee perspective and find ways to integrate that. Just start small. That would be the first thing. Now, managers need to understand that they're where the rubber meets the road. They have the most outsized impact of any person on the employee experience that person has, because they represent the company, they represent opportunity, they represent listening, they represent trust with the company, they represent your job. They can decide whether or not you keep your job. And so that power has impact on people. Start by understanding that power dynamic. Understand that when you say things, people aren't necessarily agreeing with you, but they're just accepting what you say and doing it because you're the manager. And for managers, the other thing I would say is that make sure you recognize that all of experience is filtered through expectations, which means that each one of your team has different expectations and needs to be understood and communicated with differently. Because two people can have literally the exact same experience, and one person could be miserable and the other person could be inspired. because we all come with our own frames, our own expectations. And by understanding that each person has their own expectations, you can adopt to that. Because no matter what you want to do, no matter what you want to change, no matter what you want to implement, the person will still be coming with their expectations. And it's easier to align what you're trying to do with that than trying to just dramatically move them over to something that they don't want to do. So those would be my two recommendations, because for leaders, and leaders should also remember that they're managers too, that they're managers of people. So everything that I said about managers also applies to executives.
I think so much of what you just said boils down to like the one fundamental concept of like communication, like communicating and actually having legitimate communication. So what you just extrapolated on was ways and or the different mediums of communication and or understanding that would have to be developed, because that's mostly what communication is. It's understanding. So having that empty chair, or having that, like having those maybe like one-on-one meetings with each individual person if you're the manager, to get that communicate and understand what they need and what they want out of their experience, and how you can sort of meet them with that. So there's this concept of design, and that's one that I know that's really close to you, because that's in your name of your consulting company. How does this idea that I want you to explain this idea, because I think it's such a cool word. How does this idea of Sonder affect the employee experience designing, like designing that experience?
So Sonder, for those that don't know, is the recognition that everybody has the same complexity and depth of thinking in life that you have, that everybody is the protagonist of their own story. And that is one of the things that's completely ignored and forgotten by traditional management. Because traditional management comes from the Industrial Revolution, that it's just, the organization's just a machine. Everybody's replaceable. Everybody's just an exchangeable part. And we decide how we want the organization to be, and everybody has to align behind that. Whereas Sonder breaks that frame entirely and says every single person within the organization, the CEO, their team, middle managers, supervisors, frontline staff, every single person has their own ideas, objectives, and life that goes on outside of work. And so it means that if you recognize that as a manager, as a leader, you can't just implement top down these ideas that you think are good with the narrative in your own head, because everybody else has ideas and has perspectives that may add value to it. You can't ask everybody all things at all times, and there's a way you need to be intentional about collecting these things. There's also a balance that needs to be created between leadership needs to stand for what it stands for while collecting the opinions and perspectives of employees. So Sonder means that as a manager, each of my direct reports has their own belief system. So I can't come in as a manager and say, well, this is my style, this is how you're going to treat me, and this is how it's going to go. Because you're going to get people who are going to reject that. You're going to demotivate them. Whereas if you understand that you have a style, and how do you mesh your style with each other person's individual style, you'll get a lot further. Because as you're talking about communication, and I want to emphasize that it's a two-way communication. Leadership is able to convey what they care about, what they're trying to accomplish, but they're also collecting voice of the employee, right? That there's two sides to it. And so leadership needs to understand that, and a manager needs to understand that each person there is a protagonist. Each one has their own expectations. And just because you're the protagonist of your story, traditionally that means, oh, I'm going to come in and I'm going to steer this ship how I want it. I'm going to decide how things are. Well, you're not going to create the relationship and the foundation for that communication by doing it that way. You'll think you do, because employees will smile and nod and tell you what you want to hear, but you're not going to actually get the communication that you need and they need to be effective. And so that's why Sonder, I find, is so important and such a helpful concept for leaders and managers to understand. It's not about you. It's not about just what you want. It's about how you work with others and create the environment for them to achieve what they want.
There's this psychological concept that, and it's the part of development, right? I have a little baby girl right now. She was born during quarantine, so she's a quarantine baby, but not like the other quarantine babies, which will hit in December. Um, and so, but she doesn't have a concept of other. It's just the concept of her. I think all of us just sort of exist. We're big fuzzy shapes that sort of exist to fulfill her needs. And that's one of the big parts of development as a child, was when you grow up, is to understand that other people exist, right? That's like the first step. It's like, oh, they're also a me. That's a weird thought. And then as we grow up, and now I used to teach high school, and the concept of the students had so much trouble understanding that other people were people too. Like they had complexities and such. And so they were like one step closer, but it only almost worked as if how much it fulfilled their own needs. And that's one of the big pieces of development. And I think psychological development talks a lot about the more you're aware of other is the further along you are on the development scale. And I think the concept of Sonder is like this huge awareness that becomes like almost infringing, because it's every single person all of a sudden becomes a protagonist, right? I definitely feel like I'm the protagonist for my story. That's how we're wired. And so I often forget that, like, every other single person in the world, it's like we can't all be famous because we each feel like we're famous to our own story, but we can't focus all that attention to everybody else. And that really brings me to, like, I think what's well, I'll probably have to be my last like main question is, how do we go about actually like making actionable steps, especially as a company? You can't be in the minds of 500 employees and thousands of customers and experience every single one of their experiences, especially for all 8 pillars. What's something actionable that you can do?
To be honest with you, it really depends on where you are in your evolution, because there are organizations that are already actioning these things, collecting voice of employee and doing amazing things. And there, for them, I think the ideal, down the road would be to be able to ensure that all managers are able to collect that freely, that you create that free flow of conversations right up the ladder, break that iceberg of ignorance. So that would be the first thing, is for those companies. But for those that are really not very far along on that, and early in that evolution, built on a more traditional frame, what I would do is start by asking questions. Start by asking questions of direct reports. Needs to start at the top. It needs to start with the CEO, asking questions that they might not like the answers. Asking questions that where they're missing the mark on their own team's experience. Because the reality is that executives are employees too. They're having an experience, and if their experience isn't aligned to being great executives, then that's just going to flow down the line. So the CEO needs to start by asking with their own team and try to create a psychologically safe environment to do this. And then if you ask a question, do something about it, because nothing will create cynicism more quickly than when you ask the question, they know there's a problem, they know there's a problem, and then you do nothing. They won't answer the question again. At least they won't answer it honestly.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think it's a really good end note for this conversation, like to wrap that up, because we've talked about there's a need for us to fill that experience, because that experience is so much bigger than just our workplace experience. And we talked about all the different pieces of that, and then how each one of us needs to be aware of how everyone else is actually engaging that experience too, and have that empathetic link to other people, especially as we stand in management and or leadership roles in a company, and then the actions we have to take to that to properly communicate that, and then most importantly to act on that communication. I think that what you were just saying just now, where we have to do what we say, especially like that's really what it is. And everyone's like, of course, do what you say, but actually do it. There's so many people who say, oh yeah, we listen to our employees. Here's a survey, and everyone takes the survey, and everyone fills out the survey. Some people fill them out with joke answers. I was recently, I was with one of my friends, and they were asked a survey like this, and they handed it to their sister, and they said, just fill out whatever you want. No one's going to read it anyways. And that's such an unfortunate thing, and I think we need to be, especially if you're higher up in the company, you need to be really aware of that, and you need to make those changes that people are saying, because you need to be aware that that's actually how they're experiencing that, their experiences, and you have some duty and responsibility to help them, because it's so much part of their lives, and it's also going to reflect back in the company on how the company proceeds and how the company culture looks, and how even the profitability of the company, because people will be more engaged and more active in their work and not feeling the pit of the stomach Sunday feeling. So
absolutely.
So okay, well, I think that really wraps up again what we've talked about. And I think I want to end here with what we like to end with is some fun questions. I got 10 fun questions. They don't really have to be serious answers, but if you really feel like there's something serious to be noted out of some of these, because some of them have a tinge of seriousness, you can think about it. But we're gonna try to sort of speed through these questions and get some really fun answers. So here's the first one. What book do you think everybody should read?
Not as a fun answer, but Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Amazing read. Absolutely one of the few books that I've ever read that has the genuine capacity to change a person's life.
By Viktor Frankl? Okay.
Viktor Frankl, yeah.
That's on my list. It's actually on my list. I have not read it. I need to now.
Amazing book. Highly recommend it.
Okay. What was the last thing you splurged on?
Last thing I splurged on. I guess I could say dinner last night. We ordered out, supported a local business. It was really tasty.
Oh, that's good. That's really nice. What is your most useless talent or superpower?
My most useless talent or superpower?
Mm-hmm. Skill you have, and it's not really, doesn't really have any practical uses.
I can tell you the set list of a lot of different Fish concerts just by the date. That is completely useless, but also a little out of date for me.
That's a funny one. What was the most interesting thing you have seen or read this week?
Most interesting thing I've seen or read this week. Mm-hmm. This week is early so far.
Yeah, it is. We're really early in the week. In the past 7 days, maybe. Like something you saw last week that you were like, oh, or like really cracked you up.
So right now, my wife and I are binge watching Avatar: The Legend of Korra. Okay. I'll tell you, that is the most interesting thing that I've been watching over the last week. It's a really good.
That's a great answer. That's on my list to watch. I'm trying to get my wife through the first series, Avatar.
Yes, that was so good. My wife and I binged that a couple of weeks ago, and now we're through that and we're watching Korra. Love it.
There's so many funny stories like with that, like Avatar. That was before I got married. I was living with some other guys, and they were like, "Dude, you got to see this before you get married. Like, you gotta finish the series." So we were like trying to binge it before my wedding date. It was really funny. That's a good show. Funny. That's a good, interesting one. Okay. What would a world entirely populated by clones of you be like?
A lot of people annoyed about how long it takes to get an answer.
Are you slow at giving answers then too?
It's not slow at giving answers. It's that my wife will ask me a question. I'll give her a 10-minute soliloquy on a million different tangents, and she'll be like, yes or no? Like it was literally like a yes or no question. So that's what I would say is it would be a lot of people waiting for answers.
That's funny. What as a child did you think would be awesome, but as an adult turns out is not?
Being able to stay up late. Although I do want to add that as a child, I also thought quicksand would play a bigger role in my life, and it did not. Something I was very concerned of as a child, and it has never come up.
All right. What word is a lot of fun to say?
Tuck, tuck, tiak, tuck.
Say that again?
Tuck, tuck, tiak, tuck.
I don't know what that is.
It's a place.
Okay.
It's fun to say.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun. I don't think I could do it. Tuk tuk tiakta?
Close.
Okay.
Close.
That is a lot of fun.
I'm not saying I pronounce it perfectly. I will be honest with you, but it's still fun to say.
What is something everybody in the world can agree on?
What is something everyone in the world can agree on? Nothing beats a good night's sleep.
That's actually a pretty good answer. If you could disinvent one thing, what would it be?
Disinvent.
Yeah. Make it cease to exist. Like, no one came up with that idea. It's gone.
Well, that's a tough one. Lying.
Lying?
Yes, like that movie.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking like that movie.
Yes, lying. I like that.
Okay. That would be nice. That'd be really nice if we could just invent that.
Make conversations easier, right? It would take a whole certain aspect of a lot of conversations just out of it.
There are a lot of good things that come out of that one. What life skills are rarely taught but are very useful? I know that's our last question. It's like it's a deep and it's a heavy one, so you want to feel like you give it a good.
I would say real listening, real in-depth listening, because even what people think is good listening isn't as good as it could be. There was a great article I read a number of years ago about quality of listeners and what makes an actually a good listener. And it's not just about nodding, and it's not just about not just waiting your turn to say something, and it's not just all about the traditional things. But a good listener, to be considered a good listener, you actually have to add something to the conversation. Being a good listener means taking what the person said, digesting it, and then giving something back, showing I listened, and here's something over and above, something insightful about it. Whereas listening at its base is really, for most of us, taught just shut up for a while. Then what's considered better listening is, listening and trying to understand. But then there is an actual next level, which is being able to add value to what the other person's experiencing, and not just, because listening isn't just hearing what the other person has to say. Most conversations, a person doesn't want you to listen just so they can get it out. They want you to listen because they want you to think or do something differently.
Wow, that's actually really fascinating, because I actually recently read an article that was similar. It was saying that people have really bad listening skills, which is something I've noticed. Most people just they sit their conversations until they can have their turn to say something. They're like, okay, when is he going to stop so I can say my piece? But this one put a really interesting spin on that. Most of us, not only is that happening, but when we do talk, most conversations, it's to steer the conversation back to ourselves, right? It's not to support them and help them proceed with their conversation. It's so that the conversation looks like you. It's like if someone talks about a car they bought, you're like, oh, I was once thinking about a car like that. I drove it like this. And then the person's forced to ask you, what did you think about it? And so we have a really nasty tendency to turn conversations to ourselves, which is extremely anti-listening. And so I think that's sitting there on top of the fact that we don't want to listen to them, and we're just sort of abiding our time until they say it.
Yeah.
Right. So.
And then there's also the psychological aspect that our brains can comprehend language at something like 2.5 times that we're able to speak it. So there's so much empty or available brain power that could just be wandering off or thinking about your next response or all of this stuff, because you're able to interpret and understand and analyze what I'm saying, and you still have brain power on top of that it wants to be doing something with. So you start thinking about either your answer and you just hold on to that response until the person finishes, or you start thinking about something else, your mind wanders, whatever it is. So there's also that psychological and just very human aspect of that. And then multiply that by the power power dynamic when it comes to managers and leadership. And now we understand why people aren't listening, why employees don't feel listened to, why they genuinely aren't listened to, because leaders and managers have this narrative in their head where they want to steer the conversation, where they want to steer the organization. And absent of Sonder, the person across the table is just a body to get the job you want done.
Wow, that I think we could have an entire conversation about this. Like this opened up like huge opening up, but I think we're out of time, so I gotta wrap this up now. So I'm gonna have to say thank you. That was, especially for that last note, such. I feel like I've learned so much today. Just this conversation. Every single time I have any interaction with anything you do, I feel like I'm coming away with so much to think about. And this time is definitely not an exception. I feel like I've got a lot of thinking to do about like everything now. My experience at work, my time off work, everything's got thinking. So if you also want to feel like that, because I think anyone who encounters your material is going to feel this way, you should definitely check out Gil on his LinkedIn, connect with him, follow him, or check out his anything he posts, and check out his company, Employee Experience Design. Right? If you feel like your company needs this, which I think all companies do, and could benefit from your counsel. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I just thank you. I appreciate the time. This has been a really great conversation. I appreciate your style. This is very conversational, very back and forth. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was my pleasure. And I think anyone listening, this will be their pleasure too.